In this video, you'll learn about the second house and the eighth house and how to make interpretations about the combinations that they can form. How can houses form combinations, you ask? There's a simple way and a less simple way. The simple way is when their lords combine somehow. So for example, if the second lord goes to the eighth house, or if the eighth lord goes to the second house, or if the second and eighth lords join somewhere, or if they mutually aspect each other. Those are traditional ways that the houses would interact based on their lords. A less simple way that the houses can interact is if you could evaluate the whole chart to see which houses are prominent in what order. Then if these houses are coming back to back, then they're interacting with each other. Or if they're at opposite ends of the string, then they're also interacting. So in order to get that evaluation of how prominent the houses are, and therefore you can order them, you would have to know how to do the astrology for that, which is explained in the 15th chapter of the classic book Paladipika. But you can also go to my website, victigera.com/h, and you can order a report called The Houses of Life. And that report, one of the key things that it has is it does all this for you and gives you a simple string of numbers, the code sequence of your houses. So if in that code you have an 8 followed by a 2 towards the front, or even towards the end of the string, or if you have a 2 followed by an 8, or if you have an 8 or 2 on opposite ends, then you have interaction between the eighth and the second house. Now that we understand how the two houses can interact, let's talk about each house on their own briefly so that you have a sense for what each one signifies. And then let's talk about interpreting how they combine with each other. So to understand the second house, what you have to know is, where is it in the sky? It's underneath the eastern horizon. So what does the second house symbolize? It symbolizes being underneath the eastern horizon. It's that simple. It signifies holding up the east or supporting the east. What's the east? The east is where the sun rises. So for example, because the sun rises in the east represents beginning. And if the second house is under there, supporting it, it represents things that are pro-beginning. So this mainly means foundations. The second house is a very foundational house. Like when you build a building, the first thing you do is establish the foundation. That's sort of before the building itself gets built. That's what the second house really is. It's the foundation for the ascendant. So it represents the natives' foundations. So it's going to show you how their stability is. Foundation really strongly affects the stability of the building, right? But it's also going to show you three very practical things that are the foundations for a person generally. The first one is their family. We're literally born from the family, and then the family helps us, raises us like you would raise a building. So second house will show the family and the other people who act like family, like people that support us, people that help us. So friends and supporters are also indicated by the conditions of the second house. Another permutation of the concept of foundations is wealth. The wealth is like the foundation for any project that you'll do. So the second house will indicate how stable and ample our basic wealth status is. And the third important permutation of foundations is health. Just like wealth is the basis for projects, health is also the basis for anything that you'll do with your body. So the second house indicates our health and things related to health, like how we eat, our nutrition, our diet, and things like that. So all of that is just because the eastern horizon is where the sun rises, and the sun rises the beginning, and this below the beginning where the second house is stuff that helps beginnings. Another thing about the sun rising is that it makes things visible. So helping things be visible is what the second house signifies, and that means having knowledge about things. Second house does not lead to things becoming unknown. It leads to things becoming known or seen. So it's a house for knowledge, and it also indicates our sense of realism or practicality. How much we deal with things that are actually visible and tangible. versus how much we deal with things that can't really be demonstrated. So in a nutshell, that's basically everything that you should know about the second house. All little tiny specific details about it, like, well, it also represents the mouth, can just be derived if you understand this basic tree. Of course, it's the mouth. The mouth is where you eat. Eating is nutrition. Nutrition is health. Health is the foundation. That's the second house. So let's do a similar thing for the 8th house before we move on to see how to interpret combinations of the 2nd and 8th. The 8th house is actually 180 degrees across the sky from the 2nd. So instead of being below the east, it's above the west. Because it's above the west, it's the place where all the weather and the wind and the rain is, which causes erosion. So the houses that are above the horizon, they erode the significations of the horizon. That's like the 8th and the 12th. Whereas the houses that are below the horizon, they support the significations of the horizon. That's the 2nd and the 6th. So the 8th house being above the western horizon is going to erode the things that the west signifies. What's something that the west signifies? Well, in the east, the sun rises. In the west, the sun sets. So since the east signifies beginnings, sunrise, the west signifies endings, sunset, or birth on the east and death on the west. So the 8th house, being the eroder of that, it's actually the anti-death signifier. This is why the 8th house is known as the house for your ayush, or your longevity. How long will you live? People have kind of a backwards concept of the 8th house, which is that it's a death house, when the actual fact is that it's the life house. But if you have a backwards concept, it's still usually somewhat workable, because the opposite of something is always tied to its opposite, right? Things are always tied to their opposite. So the 8th house is actually the generator of life force, but death comes when the life force comes to its end, right? So the 8th house is very instrumental in knowing the longevity of a person, which is how you determine where the death of the person is. But it's not the death house. It's the life force house. This is why it's actually the house for sex and reproduction and the sexual organs. All of this, everything related to actual sex and reproduction is signified by the 8th house. And that's why it's also a house of sexiness, which is charisma. We call it charisma or attractiveness, or this irrational attractiveness that you can't really explain. That's an 8th house subject. So sexiness, sex, reproduction, life force, longevity, those are all things signified by the 8th house. Another thing, a different group of meaning about the 8th house is that it's anti-invisibility. The eastern horizon is where things become visible. The western horizon is where things become invisible. The sun sets. Now, above the eastern horizon is what's eroding it. So this is going against invisibility. This is why the 8th house is very associated with secrets. Anti-invisibility is the ability to know secrets. The ability to make something unseen seen. The ability to see something that's invisible is the 8th house. So it's an excellent house for discovery and finding information. This thing about knowing secrets, you can expand that into 2 permutations. The first one is mysticism. Mysticism means working with secret things. And that's why this is the house of occult. This house is the most instrumental house for any occultist, like an astrologer, etc. Because we work with secrets. We try to see things which are not commonly seen. We look at the future. We look at the past. We look at the unknown causes of things and the unknown outcomes of things. And that's the occult. Occult means things which have been hidden. And psychology is the same deal, basically. Psychology is very much an 8th house topic, because psychology means not just seeing the behavior, but seeing the unseen motivators and rationality and drivers and irrationality behind the behavior. So this is why the 8th house is the house for occultism and psychologists, because it's the house of mysticism. People that use magic, people that are good at magic, people who understand magic, and other kind of like yoga, any flavor of magic, yogic cities, or whether it's magic, pulling things out of a hat, any flavor of it means manipulating things that people don't know how to manipulate, knowing things, seeing things that people don't see. Another permutation of knowing secrets besides mysticism is being very analytical, being able to see something someone else would like to keep hidden. So the 8th house also has this very important flavor of being very critical, very good at seeing through a lie, very good at seeing through a charade or a deception. So it's very good at piercing into things deeply, critiquing things, analyzing things. Finally, the western horizon signifies other people. The eastern horizon, where the sun rises, signifies the thing which is born, you. The western horizon, where things set, signifies the opposite thing. Not you, but other people, important people. Now, if that's the western horizon, then the house which erodes the western horizon is going to be the thing that takes away from others, right? So the 8th house is the house that takes from others, gains from others. This is why we think of it as the house of inheritance. And it's the house of gifts received, or wealth which is received from somebody else. When you marry somebody and you partake of their family's wealth, that's an 8th house issue. When somebody gives you donation, that's an 8th house issue. When you get gifts and presents, that's an 8th house issue. When you inherit money, that's an 8th house issue. When you win a prize. And related to this, gaining from others, that's unintentionally gaining from others, is one thing. That's like inheritance, like they're giving to you. But the other thing is you can take from others. So the 8th house has the ability to take from others. So this is sales. The ability to sell things would be get people to give you their money. And thus it is also associated with deceptions, because it's also very familiar with secrets and how things how things work and what people can't see, but you can see. So it gives you access to be deceptive. So now you know everything important that you need to know about the 8th house and everything important that you need to know about the 2nd house. Now let's talk about how to interpret situations where the 8th and the 2nd combine. So the first thing that should come to mind is, hey, gaining from others, sales, inheritance, that sounds like it goes good with wealth. The 2nd house represents wealth and the 8th house represents gains. Sounds like it goes well together. And it does. When there's a combination between the 8th and the 2nd house, you expect the person to be wealthy. They should have wealth rather effortlessly because they know how to get money. But one thing that is touchy about the 8th and the 2nd house combinations is that it makes a difference which lord or which house is dominant and which other one is assistive. In this case with wealth, we really want the 2nd lord or house to be dominant and the 8th to be assistive. It makes a big difference whether that is true or not. If the 2nd is dominant and the 8th is assistive, then the gains are contributing to the wealth. Then the 8th house is contributing to the 2nd. But if the 8th house is dominant and the 2nd is assistive, then it's not quite as positive, because the money of the 2nd house seems to be going someplace kind of intangible. Everything about the 8th and the 2nd seems to be pretty congenial. They seem to represent congenial things because the 2nd is supporting the East and the 8th is anti-supporting the West. And the East and West are opposite. So supporting and anti-supporting are also opposite. So opposite of opposite is same. Right? So the 2nd house supporting the East should basically give you the same interpretation as the 8th house eroding the West. But that is true, but there's one basic underlying difference which clashes a bit. It's that the 8th house is in the West and the 2nd house is in the East. So the 8th house is more intangible and abstract because it's where the sun sets, whereas the 2nd house is more practical and tangible and physical because it's where the sun rises. So we prefer to see the second lord dominating, going into the 8th house, for example, taking over the 8th house, rather than the 8th lord coming to the 2nd house and dominating that. Or in the house sequences, you would prefer to see 2 come first, supported by 8. If you see 2 and 8 on the opposite sides, then it's a red flag for money. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the 2nd house is the house of family. And the 8th house is the house of reproduction. How do you get a family? By reproduction. So, bam. That seems to be very congenial and synergistic. And it is. So when the 8th and the 2nd lords combine, expect the person to be fertile, sexy, sexually viable, etc. But, again, it makes a difference which way the lords are going. And in this case, it's the opposite from wealth. And it's going to be this way now for the remaining things that we evaluate about the 8th and the 2nd. For everything else besides wealth, we want to see the 8th lord go to the 2nd house rather than the 2nd lord go to the 8th house. We prefer it. So in terms of the house order, we prefer to see an 8 followed by a 2 rather than a 2 followed by an 8 for everything except wealth. So for fertility, for example, we want to see the lord of reproduction go into the family so that the reproduction winds up generating a family, rather than the lord of family going to reproduction, which kind of undoes the family. So this same kind of dynamic will work for the next thing that we want to talk about, which is the 2nd house is the house of knowledge. And the 8th house is the house of knowing secrets, right? It's the house of discovery. Sounds very good for knowledge. So you do expect when a chart has a combination between 2 and 8, the person knows how to find information. They're a knowledge finder. And so they get facts and they uncover truths and they're learned. But again, it's better to have the 8th lord, the seeker, go into the place of knowledge, result in knowledge, than to have the knowledge itself go to someplace intangible. And then finally, another issue which is important is the 2nd is the house of health, and the 8th is the house of life force, which is basic health. So it's a good deal. 8th and 2nd combinations, the native is healthy. It is better to have the 8th lord go to the 2nd so that the life force is winding up in generating stable health, rather than having the 2nd lord go to the 8th where the health is going to an intangible spot. All right, thank you for watching. I hope you liked it. We have a lot of videos already released on this type of subject. The 1st house with every other house, and the 2nd house with the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th are already published. In the coming weeks, we'll do the 2nd and the 9th, 2nd, 10th, 2nd, 11th, etc., and then go into the 3rd. So make sure you subscribe. Click the bell thing that will give you notifications. Click a like so YouTube directs you back to these videos more often, etc., etc., etc. And have a lovely day, and I hope this knowledge helps enrich your life.